Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and we're going to be doing our final tier list of this A4 season. It seems crazy that we're at the end of the season. We are in the midst of the third week. Presumably on Thursday this week, on the 21st, we should be getting an announcement for the next mini set, and I believe the ranked season, the A4 ranked season, actually wraps up in like 5 or 6 days. So it's coming up very, very quickly, and the seasons just end up going really quick. That's how it is in Pokemon Pocket. But right now, we're at the end, and I think that once we're in week 3 right now, and which we are, it basically means that, you know, we're now understanding what the metagame is realistically. You know what I mean? Everything kind of comes around full circle. You know, the meta develops, the counter meta develops, everything sort of balances out. And I think right now is basically as true of a interpretation of the metagame that we're ever going to get for A4. So let's go ahead and rank all of the decks in the format right now for our tier list. This is going to be our final ranking. So next week there, I guess, won't be a tier list, but again, you know, A4A will be coming out, the next mini set, so we'll have other things to worry about for sure. But anyway, we're gonna go top to bottom. But one thing that we're gonna do here is we're actually gonna change the name of this top tier, because some people just didn't like it from last week, or some people, I guess, didn't really agree with it. So we're just gonna keep this S tier. I do sort of agree with people. I didn't really figure the names of the tiers matter too much. I just wanted to kind of tier everything up one and get rid of the D tier. That was sort of what I was doing last week, but we're gonna change that, and this is just gonna be the A+ tier, because honestly, I think that in Pokemon Pocket right now, there's a ton of good decks, right? And you could be like, well, I think this deck should be B tier, but for me, like, it's basically the same. It just doesn't matter. We got rid of the D tier, and then we added like a tier above A tier, because I think that this format's very top heavy in terms of the quality of the deck lists. So we have S tier, A+ tier, A tier, B, and C tier. No D tier still, just because if a deck is D tier, then, you know, nobody's really playing it. So we have a not played tier. Everything else staying the same. We're going to start from the top down, guys. And we're going to work our way through all of these deck lists, see which decks sort of change. Again, this is sort of my final interpretations of the viability of these deck lists in the format. Again, if the season were to continue on for 2 or 3 more weeks, maybe some things would change. But at this point, I think we definitely have a pretty accurate understanding of which decks are best and not best. And the other thing that I just want to go ahead and mention is that this weekend is the Ursa Days Double Deck $10,000 tournament. Definitely go check that out. The link to limitless.com is down in the description below, and it's an upcoming Pokemon Pocket tournament. It's going to have 2,000, maybe even 3,000 plus players, $10,000 prize pool. It's a cool day 2 double deck format, super cool. Hopefully this tier list helps you guys in choosing a deck list for that tournament. So anyway, if people are really interested in it, or if double deck ends up becoming like a real format, we'll you know, incorporate that into our channel. But it's not really something that happens all the time. So all right, already too much babbling. Let's get into it. So let's start off with Espeon and Sylveon, right? And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull up Limitless right now, just so I can get an understanding of where these decks are statistically and mathematically speaking at this point in the format, right? So there's been 75 tournaments, you know, 8,000 players, 20,000 total matches here. Pretty large sample size, but I like to refer to the data as we go through it. So Espeon and Sylveon has firmly planted itself as the second most played deck so far of this tournament. However, that's only just below 8% total meta share, which is pretty staggering when you think that, you know, how popular Espeon is and how much it's seen play over the last few weeks. For it to only have an 8% meta share overall of this season is really crazy, but it is actually still floating above the most high, like the highest win rate deck out of any of the top 10 most played decks, which to me is really interesting. Guzzlord did kind of come up and overtake it, but Guzzlord actually struggled pretty heavily this week. Sylveon, Espeon still emerging in my mind as an S tier deck. It's got to stay here. This format really hasn't had like that many true S tier contenders. I think there's really maybe one other deck list, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but for right now, I think that Giratina, Darkrai, and Espeon, both S tier, specifically Espeon. I think that even though the counter meta emerged and in the most significant counter meta development throughout this entire season was around Espeon and Sylveon, you could say that all of the Oricorio decks were kind of there to hinder Giratina, Darkrai, but I think in general, people don't really play Oricorio with Giratina, Darkrai in mind. It just happens to have a pretty good matchup. And none of the Oricorio decks were like super well played. So Espeon came in like a couple days late. I think everybody was playing Crobat in the early season. What's interesting is that Crobat's one of the few decks that is strong against Espeon, and somehow Espeon still ended up being the best deck. We all know that it's broken. It's absolutely insane. The healing going second, the deck just has so much pace now. It's just a really, really consistent archetype. And when you're playing 2 copies of Sylveon and you can attack with those 2 copies of Sylveon, and you have another attacking option that can also utilize EV Bag and things. It's just a really good deck. I've talked about it so much. We've done actually a lot of gameplay on this deck, so we're not going to spend too much time about it. 54.5% win rate. It's staying S tier. No question about that. Giratina Darkrai is the other interesting one, right? Because this deck list to me also is very solid S tier. This is, again, the most played deck at a 12.5% meta share, so almost twice, or about, 50%, 60% more than Espeon throughout this entire season. The most played deck for sure. It has a 53% win rate, which is very impressive for a deck that's seen that much play. We've been keeping Espeon and Sylveon above Giratina and Darkrai, but if we're going to go ahead and we're going to talk about everything throughout this entire season as a whole, like if you look at the results from everything, I would say that Giratina Darkrai would be above it, but this isn't about results, right? This tier list is about viability and the quality of the decks in the current format, so I'm still putting Espeon as the best deck right now. I don't know if any other sort of content creators or like high-level players put Espeon in the top tier. It's tough because we haven't had a ton of super large tournaments, but I still think Espeon is the top deck right now. It just sort of beats everything out in almost every way. So anyway, Giratina Darkrai also going to go S tier. We can't move it off of S tier, to be fair. It's at the very, very top. Like I said before, we had these as meta drivers, and that's what these decks are. They just sort of are the meta game, and then everything else sort of follows suit. So Giratina Darkrai also S tier. Let's talk about Guzzlord, because we put Guzzlord at the top, at the tippity top of S tier, or I guess A+ tier last week, and Guzzlord was the top, counter meta choice. In fact, this is actually the 6th most played deck of the format, so it actually has risen in play recently, and still has a 53.5% win rate, so it's actually higher than Giratina Darkrai, and it's around the same things as like Buzzwole. It's an incredibly successful deck list. However, I also feel like this deck is pretty determined about being good against Espeon specifically, you know what I mean? And I think that Darkrai exists a lot in this format, so this past week, the rest of the metagame has really sort of also kind of come up, and things have balanced out pretty dramatically, and I think that Guzzlord has struggled pretty highly. I think other decks also started to account for Guzzlord a little bit more, and its results, at least this past week, were really quite dim, and I think that's just a result of the counter meta sort of having a rebound effect and becoming, again, just less relevant, as we go into the third week. Like, going into the second week, Guzzlord looked to be the top deck. It had the highest win rate. It was flying through, but it quickly fell off, and that's what happens with like countered meta decks. It's not driving the meta, it's just reacting to the metagame, which of course is Espeon. So, how I feel about Guzzlord, I still feel quite highly about it, but in its current viability at the end of this season, when we kind of approach the end of things, I'm actually going to put it down into the A tier. I don't think that it's an A+ tier. I do want to be pretty selective with the decks that we put in A+, because to me, those are, we're going to be reserved for like the other like best decks that aren't necessarily Espeon and Giratina. But Guzzlord is really good. It'll probably be at the very top of A tier. Charizard's an interesting one for sure, because Charizard is the 4th most played deck of this format and has slowly crept its way up to about almost an exact 50% win rate, which is, to be fair, what you would expect with things like Charizard. There's a fair amount of Oricorio in the format, whether that's with Silvally decks or Arceus decks or Pikachu decks. Which is on the tier list this week, by the way. A lot of Oricorio. And what that means for Charizard is that half the players aren't even playing any tech for Oricorio. They're just going to end up losing to it, and just sort of, conceding that matchup. But in tournament play, what happens is that that Charizard player doesn't always, match up against an Oricorio, and it just ends up doing really well. All of the Oricorio decks aside, and I guess Guzzlord aside as well, Charizard does really good into, Giratina Darkrai decks, into Sylveon, Espeon, Buzzwole, like Leafeon, Flareon, and even against like Arceus and Tapu Koko decks. I know that they play Oricorio, but those Pokemon specifically, it does really well against. So I really like Charizard. Again, the 4th most played deck, 50% win rate. It would be hard for me to really put it in the A+ tier, but this is also a really, really strong deck. So I'm going to keep it here into the A tier. I'm actually going to move it down, rather, into the A tier, because I just don't feel as strongly about it as I kind of did maybe at one particular time. But again, all of the data does show that it is consistently performing better as time goes on, which you can kind of expect from Charizard. But this season wasn't nearly as kind to Charizard as last season was, which there's just more sort of different ways people are playing Oricorio and Lightning type decks right now, and Charizard just doesn't love that, honestly. So yeah, shout out to Charizard. Still a really good deck. It's going to go high A tier, but not A+ tier. That's sort of my own opinion. Okay. Next up are like the Silvally decks, which does make things a little bit sort of muddy. Like it's hard to really quantify a lot of these decks because they're split up into different categories on Limitless. But right here, what we have is Silvally Darkrai, and here we have Silvally Pichu. So this is like Turbo Silvally with Oricorio, and this is Turbo Silvally like with Oricorio, but also with Darkrai. Technically, they're different decks. It's whether or not you're playing Darkrai or not. But to be honest with you, I think that these are the best decks. Silvally, when you're playing Zeraora and not Pichu, is distinctly a little bit worse, which is why last week we put it down here in A tier. These two decks probably should be combined. Like we could just get rid of this, Silvally deck with Darkrai on the tier list because most decks are just playing Darkrai and Oricorio, but some aren't. And that's the weird thing about this deck is that whether you're including Darkrai, which is going to help you in some matchups, I guess, specifically against things like Espeon, while also helping you a little bit more maybe in the mirror matchup against other Oricorio decks, it doesn't actually dramatically increase the overall win rate of your deck. It's just the idea is if you're playing the Pichu variant with Oricorio, you're going to win games, and you're going to have maybe some of a better matchup against some decks when you're playing Darkrai. You're going to have different matchup spreads if you're not playing Darkrai. Both of them are really good. So the confusion here, I guess, is that both of these decks are kind of the same. Almost every player now is incorporating just one Darkrai in their Pichu, Silvally, or Oricorio deck because it just, I think, is kind of worth it. And it doesn't really change the deck around that much. It doesn't make it any worse. Arguably makes it better, but they're both almost identical decks. And I think they're both still A+ tier deck lists, right? So Silvally Pichu is a 53.2% win rate deck list. And again, Limitless categorizes this as Silvally Pichu, but a lot of these Silvally Pichu decks are just playing Darkrai. So I know that there's two images here. I'm just going to show one deck list on the screen, and that is sort of what I would, I guess, in general, categorize these two archetypes under, which is very similar. I know it's confusing. I guess we'll just get rid of, I don't know. Technically, they're different, right? Because some of those players are also not playing Darkrai. So we're going to keep them both on the tier list because they are two different decks technically, but Limitless is categorizing them as the same, and they're both really strong. So they're going to stay in A+ tier. In my mind, the best way to play Silvally right now. And I think that's definitely that's for sure the case. So not much else that I have to say about that, but the Silvally Pichu decks are insane. We talked a lot about baby Pokemon and how they impacted the metagame yesterday in Meta Monday. And if you didn't watch that video, maybe go check it out. But baby Pokemon have been really influential in the meta, and I can't really. I know for some reason, it's weird. Like people sort of fought against the baby Pokemon stuff, but they are in general actually really good, and they see a lot of play relatively. So anyway, those decks staying up there in the A+ tier, not S tier, but definitely sort of a notch above a lot of these decks that are going to be in the A tier. We've talked about Guzzlord, Charizard. So next up, we've gotten Flareon and Leafeon. So what's really interesting about this deck list, and again, I tried my hardest not to disrespect this deck, it's just not nearly as good as you might think it is, right? I mean, it's the 7th most played deck of this format. It is behind things like Guzzlord and Sylveon and Greninja, Buzzwole, Charizard, Espeon, Giratina, Darkrai. Those are all the more played deck lists, but basically every single one of those decks, besides Charizard, does actually have a pretty significantly higher win rate than this deck. So I can't really justify keeping this thing or moving this thing out of A tier. This deck list is good. It's actually quite strong, but what I find really interesting with Flareon and Leafeon is that a lot of the matchups at the top of the metagame just realistically aren't that kind to it, and also Sylveon Greninja is a good matchup against Flareon Leafeon, and it still sees a lot of play, which is weird. Technically, you have a winning matchup into Espeon, but none of those matchups are what I call significantly high in terms of the win rates, you know what I mean? And there's also another Flareon deck, which over time actually has just sort of proven to be a better deck, which is crazy. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So Flareon Leafeon is not bad whatsoever, but in my mind is definitely an A tier deck. I'm not even going to touch it. I'm going to keep it right there. And yeah, comment down below if you guys disagree with that, but honestly, the data shows it, and it hasn't really won anything significant this entire season. So next up, though, is going to be Buzzwole. This is basically every Buzzwole deck, Grass, Ultra Beast deck, kind of merged into one, whether you're playing Kartana or Pheromosa, Two Cyrus, whatever you're playing, it's Grass, Ultra Beast. And I've been actually a little bit disrespectful to Buzzwole this whole season because in my experience as an Espeon player, I feel like that matchup isn't very good for Buzzwole. But I do recognize that this is a very strong deck, and it has remained relevant because Guzzlord kind of rose in play, and I find that definitely to be quite interesting. Giratina Darkrai has had a healthy balance at the very top of the metagame, seeing the most play, and Buzzwole traditionally likes that matchup. So again, we've gone through the whole counter meta phase. We've seen how everything develops. I personally think that Buzzwole is actually a really, really good deck still. I know I kind of disrespected it, but this is the quintessential top of A tier deck list. It's similar to Espeon in the sense that it can heal. It has Gust, it has damage, it has free retreat, it can get around Oricorio. It kind of does everything. But in a way that I guess isn't super great into Espeon. You know what I mean? So like there is a case to put Buzzwole in the S tier. That is a question here. The thing is, Buzzwole's good against Giratina. But it's bad against Espeon, relatively speaking, right? But it's also pretty good against the Silvally decks. Traditionally, Buzzwole's done well against Silvally, but a lot of these decks in A tier actually have strong matchups into Buzzwole, which is why I can't necessarily keep it there into the S tier. So it's going to go at the very top of A+ tier. I'm going to give Buzzwole some respect. Some people might even find that disrespectful that it's not S tier, but Buzzwole is like, in my mind, like in my vision, how I interpret the metagame, it's like at the very, very top of everything other than S tier. You know what I mean? So at the top of A+ tier is where it's going to go. Silvally Zeraora. This is an interesting one as well. It technically sees basically a little bit more play than like Silvally Pichu, or at least it has throughout the season, but has a less high win rate. I think it's basically like a 95% of the same deck list, but in general, I think that Pichu is just better. So we always sort of do that on the tier list. It's hard to rank something when there's another deck list that's very similar to it, but just not as good. Or it's just a little bit better. So that's where sort of the Zeraora Silvally stuff is, quite frankly. And I still think it's an A tier deck. So I'm honestly not even going to move this deck. I'm going to keep it right here. Again, the difference between Silvally Pichu and Silvally Zeraora is super tiny, but it is technically an upgrade in my mind if you're playing the baby Pokemon instead of Zeraora, which in general just sort of makes it better. So we're going to put it a tier higher. We have to segment them in tiers, right? Next up is going to be Arceus and Tapu Koko, which is technically a different deck than what a lot of the Arceus decks seeing play right now are. So for that reason, as we see down here, there's this Arceus Pichu deck list. There's also Dark Arceus. So there's a lot of different Arceus decks that have popped up recently. There's Fire type Arceus, which isn't on the tier list because it doesn't really see that much play. There's even like some Water type Arceus decks, the Lightning type Arceus package. Tapu Koko and Arceus is an interesting deck list. It does play Oricorio and it'll play like Zeraora, but I think at this point people have really just leaned into like the Turbo Arceus stuff, which is mainly just sort of not really accounting or playing for Tapu Koko, you know what I mean? So Tapu Koko's mostly found its way into like Pikachu decks as the season's gone on. This is a good deck, though. It's got a good deck, though. It has, it's the 14th most played deck of the format, and it's a 52% win rate. Very respectable deck list. In fact, I'm actually going to put it in the A tier, but I'm actually going to put Flareon, Leafeon below all of these other decks in the A tier. But Arceus Tapu Koko here is very similar in my mind to Silvally Zeraora. You'll wait a little bit because it's hard. There is differences between these Arceus decks because there's so many of them, but they play differently. So Arceus and Tapu Koko, specifically when those two cards are put together in a deck list, is in my mind like a middle A tier deck. So that's where it's going to go. We already talked about Flareon, Leafeon. And next up, we've got Ho-Oh and Snorlax. So how do we feel about Ho-Oh Snorlax? It's actually the most played Ho-Oh deck, but as the time has gone on, again, it was a weird deck that kind of popped up specifically because it was seemingly strong against Espeon, but Espeon sort of pivoted by playing the non-EX Espeon, and I think a lot of people learned how to play against this deck, which dramatically decreased its win rate for sure. This definitely had its time in the spotlight. It's the 11th most played deck of the format for sure. Ho-Oh is a very interesting card. This is sort of the version that more people ended up playing. I can get around Oricorio decks pretty easily, which is kind of funny, but then Turbo Arceus started to see more play, and that's more of a difficult thing to work around for this deck. I don't think it's A tier anymore. This is the 11th most played deck, and it has a 48% win rate, which has definitely gone down. I need to update my matchup spreadsheet in the Discord server, by the way. Shout out to the Discord link down in the description below. I need to update that, which I guess I'll do maybe one of these days. I know the season's coming to an end, so I probably should have done it a few days ago. But anyway, Ho-Oh Snorlax is going to go down here into the B tier. That is a drop down for Ho-Oh Snorlax. Still not a bad deck, but it's hard for me to consider it on the same level as these decks that we have here in A tier and above. Next up is Crobat. So again, are we really gonna spend too much time talking about Crobat? I feel generally quite bad about it. It's not a bad deck list. It's not. It's just that a lot of the format right now isn't super kind to Crobat, and it kind of came in at a time where if Crobat entered the metagame maybe 2 or 3 seasons ago, it would have been really strong, just the way that things were at that time. But right now, it just isn't what we wanted. It's not what we need. And I think a lot of the best Dark type decks are things like Darkrai and Guzzlord. So as like a Dark type high roll aggro deck list. It just doesn't fit that mold because we have Dark Arceus, we've gotten Darkrai, Silvally, we have Guzzlord Naganadel, which are all really fast-paced aggressive decks. Crobat just doesn't do it as well. It's just not as strong of a deck. To me, this is still a B tier deck list. It's not going to change at all. And I think that that's kind of crazy, but that's where it has to go. So Crobat and Sylveon is going to stay there in the B tier. It's a very B tier deck. It's actually the 8th most played deck of the format, but only has a 48% win rate overall, and it hasn't really done anything substantial since the season began. So it's like, I'm not really going to change it. You know what I mean? Sylveon Greninja, right? So this is another interesting one. Basically 50% flat win rate. This is a deck that gets absolutely mopped up by Espeon. Espeon Sylveon basically took this archetype and just sort of removed it from the game. Not entirely, of course. This is, like I said, still the 5th most played deck, but it took its spot in the meta, and I think that it operates a little bit similarly. So, like, this is how, like, this deck is, in my mind, I guess, like a mix between Buzzwole and Espeon Sylveon. It just doesn't do what either of them do as well. In general, just less consistent. It does have that high roll potential, which is pretty cool, just to get that Greninja out on turn 2 and to get like a couple Psychic Energies on Giratina out early. Like, there's a lot of moving pieces with this deck, so it's a bit awkward. And I think that the format being a little bit more consistent and fast-paced has struggled with this archetype, or made this archetype struggle. B tier is probably fine for it, and I don't really want to move it. I guess I'll put it like above these two decks on the B tier, but I don't think it's like... It's definitely not A tier. I guess there's a case to maybe put this bottom A tier. In fact, maybe I will. I'm kind of disrespecting this deck a little bit, again, just because Espeon exists. But this isn't a B tier deck. It's got to go A tier. I'm backtracking there. I'm actually going to put it right below Flareon and Leafeon because these two decks, to me, actually operate at a very, very similar sort of, I guess, viability rate in the current season. So we're going to put them both like next to each other. I guess I'll put this one at the bottom, but yeah, anyway, Flareon Greninja, or sorry, not Flareon, Sylveon Greninja, not a bad deck whatsoever. Bottom A tier, I think, is pretty comfortable for me when I'm ranking that deck list. However, now we have Turbo Flareon, which again is a big reason why I dropped down Flareon Leafeon. Turbo Flareon has actually emerged as one of the best decks in the game. Like I don't think if people really realize that, because it's not still seeing like that much play. We talked about this deck literally weeks ago. It's honestly the better way to play Flareon in almost every way. The format right now is very early game dependent, and most decks that can get to a massive advantage really early in the game end up just sort of being really decent choices because you're either one of those decks that's very volatilely powerful in the early game, or you're just a really consistent deck in that mid to late game, like a Giratina Darkrai, like a Charizard, things like that, right? So this to me is definitely the more upside way to play Flareon. Sorry, I have something in my eyeball. We're not going to edit this out. I'm just going to scratch my eye while I'm recording this entire video. One eye. Should I get an eye patch or something? Flareon and Magby. Turbo Flareon is what we call this. Another example of baby Pokemon actually really improving an archetype, but for whatever the reason, baby Pokemon just didn't really, they don't register in people's minds for whatever reason. I think people in their heads still don't think they're that good, but they are. Like, they actually are really strong. We're going to shock the world. I'm putting Flareon, Turbo Flareon in the A+ tier. This, again, might sound crazy. It is the 15th most played deck overall of this format, but it has a 54% win rate, has consistently placed actually really well in tournaments over the last few days. It's just it's very similar to some of these really aggro archetypes like, Turbo Darkrai or Turbo Arceus, which, again, we have to talk about. These are decks that just have insane potential in the early game, and if you play enough games, especially for ranked mode, I mean, absolutely insane. If you get, if you play these decks in tournaments, you just got to get lucky, I guess 10 games in a row or whatever, but in ranked mode, they're fast paced and then it helps you rank up quickly. Turbo Flareon is really strong. And it just there's nothing else to say about it. People might not believe me, but I've been kind of singing this deck's praises for quite some time, and I still believe that it's actually really strong. So I'm going to actually put it in the A+ tier. In fact, right now, I actually would rank it above all of these decks in A tier, which might be crazy. Maybe that's the spicy take of the week, but that's what we're doing. What's up next here? In the B tier, we've gotten, what do we have? Donphan and Rampardos here. So this is a tough one, definitely, because Donphan Rampardos generally just never saw any play. In fact, Donphan in general completely fell off the map, which is tough, right? Because, as the meta goes on, people just choose to play the decks that are successful, right? If a deck is floating around 48 to 49% win rate, Like, people just don't play it. Like, so we're now into the third week, and Donphan is just not something you're really going to see much, especially in Master Ball tier or in tournaments. So, you know, RIP to Donphan, and we're actually going to put it down here in not played, which is tough. But, you know, we just can't, like, we can't really rank it. Like, it's hard, you know, it's just hard for us to justify, you know, describing Donphan in any kind of way when nobody's playing it and we just don't have any results and we don't have any data. But anyway, you know, RIP to Donphan. The B tier is looking a little slim. Let's see if we can change that. Ho-Oh and Lugia. You know, this is also an interesting one. I actually feel like Ho-Oh Lugia is also not a bad deck list. What I'm going to do here is probably actually put Crobat at the top of B tier. I'm going to put both of the Ho-Oh decks next to each other because what seemed like Snorlax to be a much more, I guess, understandable counter meta deck list, which just sort of was specifically good in certain scenarios in the format, didn't end up being really any better because, you know, the counter meta ended up kind of going away and everything got spread out. So the same amount of viability increase that Snorlax got by being specifically really good against like Espeon and some of these other top matchups, Ho-Oh and Lugia also just sort of kept up by, again, being really strong in the sense that it can KO some of these really bigger Pokemon like Guzzlord. So Ho-Oh Lugia is still a decent deck list. I think this is the, let's see, it's the 19th most played deck of this format and it has a 47% win rate. I guess maybe that does justify like a C tier placement. Was it that much worse? I mean, it's not even that much worse than Ho-Oh and Snorlax, to be, if I'm being honest with you there. It's kind of a crazy thing to rank. So we're just going to keep them B tier, you know what I mean? Because relatively speaking, those aren't bad deck lists. I know those win rates sound low, but you know, when you're playing against all of the decks above it here on the tier list, like that's what happens, you know what I mean? Like meme decks are still going to get bodied by all of these B tier decks. That doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that the meta has a lot of really strong decks above it. What do we got next? Leafeon and, yeah, okay, so Leafeon and Executor, this was like the Grass Will deck. The 31st most played deck, this deck just isn't seeing play either. It was, again, kind of memey and played saw a bit of play early on in the season, but it drastically fell off. Unfortunately for this deck list, it's a fun thing. Like, I like Leafeon and I like Will and I like Executor. It's just not like a meta contending deck. So again, nobody's playing it, so it's got to fall into the not played tier. Pretty tough for sure. But a lot of these decks that are on new to the tier list, like these are going to replace a lot of these BC tier decks probably because people are just playing these right now instead of some of these decks in the C tier. Dragonite as well. You know, Dragonite, you know, I guess people are still playing Dragonite, so we have to give it some type of a respect. But in general, like, I mean, are we actually? Dragonite's going to stay C tier. Honestly, we need a deck like at the bottom of the actual tier list, so that's where Dragonite's going to stay. But yeah, nothing else to really say about Dragonite, honestly. Just not consistent enough, not fast-paced enough. Like the format with what Baby Pokemon did was it made so many deck lists just so fast. Like that's what it did. It's similar to like when Rare Candy came out and people were like pumped about Stage 2 Pokemon, but then all it did was turn certain Stage 2 decks into like aggro high roll deck lists. Like Baby Pokemon did the same thing, where it was like Arceus was like a pretty fine tempo card, but now it's just really good in aggro, you know, like combo decks and like same with Flareon, you know what I mean? Like that's what Baby Pokemon did. And Dragonite and these sort of really slower kind of high roll decks like have a lot of potential, but you're just going to get absolutely ran through by some of these really fast paced decks. And that's where Dragonite is. Still sees a little bit of play. We're going to keep it in the C tier. What is this? Blacephalon, Sylveon, or yeah, Silvally, fire type Silvally, I guess. I don't even know. This was, again, an old archetype that people don't really play. Going into the not play tier, this is literally the graveyard. This is the graveyard of the format. These are all of the decks that saw play at one point, but just nobody plays anymore. And that's what happens, you know, as the metagame evolves. It's like people try new things, they're having fun with new decks, but then like, you know, they kind of lock in and they're like, all right, you know, we'll play like the real decks, we'll hit Master Ball, we'll try to climb here, we'll try to win tournaments. Like people kind of understand what it is, right? And people get all of the cards too, so that's another factor as well. Fire type Silvally, it just doesn't make sense really to play it when we have like Turbo Flareon and we also have all of the Silvally decks that are playing Lightning, right? So it's like, why would we sort of try to match the two together when it just doesn't make that much sense? Which, to be fair, I guess is the case with fire type Silvally, so we're gonna put it in not played. Magcargo. Are we gonna keep Magcargo on the tier list? I mean, it's the 28th most played deck. Again, still a 42% win rate. It's been sitting at 42% this whole time. I'm gonna keep it there into the C tier. We're moving a lot of decks just into not played, and Magcargo still sees some meme amounts of play here. But yeah, Turbo Flareon is just like a way better version of this, which is crazy to me. But people like it. It's funny. You know, it's a funny deck, and yeah. Sure. We're actually going to keep Donphan Lucario in the C tier as well. I'm actually going to put it at the top of C tier, and the reason I'm going to do that is just because Donphan does still see a little bit of play, but if anyone is playing Donphan, they're playing it with Lucario, and it is the 15th most played deck of the format, so we have to like rank it. Rampardos sees a lot less play; it's like the 30th most played deck. So Donphan, it's a C tier deck in my mind. I mean, I guess maybe you could put it in the B tier, but we can't be giving all of these decks, you know, a little bit of a boost here. I mean, this is like a 45% win rate deck list. It's really not great. Fighting needs a big buff. Hopefully next set, maybe fighting gets a big increase. Like that would be pretty cool. But yeah. RIP to Donphan and all of the Donphan enjoyers. It just didn't end up really being that useful in the format. Specifically, it's probably decent against Oricorio. Or I guess, yeah, well, yeah. I mean, if you're playing Lucario, that's going to be, it's a fighting deck. So you're good in like certain scenarios, but like most decks right now they don't really care much about Donphan. So C tier it goes. Let's wrap up this video by talking about the last 4 decks. Again, all of these decks in not played tier. We're not going to talk about them. They went into the graveyard, forever lost. So RIP to them. Next up, let's talk about Greninja and Oricorio, which is a really interesting deck that, again, always ends up kind of just creeping its way into the metagame a couple weeks in because it's just a decent deck. And I think that some people really just enjoy playing like a really control-based sort of counter meta deck, right? We're playing Cyruses and we're playing Greninjas and Oricorios. Like it's a way to like really control the game, whereas when you're normally playing Oricorio, you're just sort of hoping that your opponent doesn't have an answer and you just come in and hit with Oricorio. So it's a bit more of an interactive Oricorio deck, but still not as consistent, or I guess just in general as good as like a lot of the other Oricorio decks, but it's not bad. The 22nd most played deck. Somehow it's just sort of risen in play here, and it's got about a 50% exact win rate. So to me, that means this thing is B tier, but I'm actually going to put it at the top of B tier, and I think that's honestly a very respectable choice. We could put it low A tier, but no, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna put it like high B tier. Low A tier, high B tier is the same thing, but I definitely, we just got to fill out the B tier some way, so that's what we're gonna do. Anybody that loves this deck, I apologize. Again, like B tier is not bad. But this deck hasn't actually done anything other than sort of rise and play late in the season and like win 50% of the game. So there you go. Next up is Pikachu. So yeah, let's actually talk about Pikachu and put it on the tier list because we've really yet to do that so far. So Pikachu is kind of like the weird like fringe off meta deck of the last few weeks. It sort of rose up. We talked about it a bit on the channel. It's really not a bad deck. But is it a deck that's like real in the metagame, right? We have to go off instincts a little bit right now because Pikachu, it's split. Like a lot of people are playing different versions. Like on Limitless, it's categorized as like Pikachu and Zapdos, like Pikachu and Pikachu, Pikachu and Pichu, Pikachu Tapu Koko. So people are kind of pairing Pikachu EX, the genetic Apex one, with a bunch of different Pokemon, and we're going to try to bundle them all into the same category. Likely going to be floating around 50%, which is really not that bad. But in general, I wouldn't say that this is like a deck that's really blowing me away. So I'm actually also going to put it B tier. And we're going to put it above Greninja or Oricorio B tier. But these 2 decks to me are definitely not like super high tier potential, but they are really decent decks. So, you know, yeah, I mean, it's impressive that genetic Apex Pikachu, and quite frankly, is in the B tier. So shout out to Pikachu, the OG, coming back, and it kind of makes sense, you know, given, I guess, all of the really strong lightning cards that are in the format. And next up, what do we got? We've got, let's do Dark Arceus, because, you know, Dark Arceus is like a real deck. And we talked about it, I think, a few days ago. It just makes a lot of sense. You know, didn't see a lot of play early on in the format, but it is definitely rising in play. At this point, it's the 33rd most played deck overall of the format. Again, it makes sense because it came in late, but it does have a 52.5% win rate. It's a very respectable deck list. I don't know if I really want to put this in A tier either, but honestly, I kind of do. Like, do we put it like bottom A tier? Yeah, let's put it bottom A tier. I think it's just, in general, a better deck than Pikachu EX and then Greninja and Oricorio. And I think it does something unique where it kind of mixes some of that Turbo Arceus with some of the really high-end kind of combo high-roll Arceus stuff all together in a really interesting deck. It does have a lot of moving parts, which is why I think it's actually appropriate to put it right next to Sylveon and Greninja, because they are actually very similar decks in terms of how they function and all of the different moving pieces. They both play sort of support bench-hitting Stage 2 Pokemon. They've gotten really consistent, you know, basic attackers, and then, of course, they have sort of those ancillary pieces, that being sort of the baby, you know, turbo engine, and then, you know, Sylveon, the draw engine, right? So they're actually very similar decks. These are like 2 sides of the same coin, which I find to be massively interesting, and I think it's cool to put them together on the tier list. Lastly, we've gotten true turbo Arceus, which normally is playing Arceus EX with Pichu, with Oricorio, and Zero Aura. So it's really just all about like playing as much, you know, I guess pace support and consistency for that aggro strategy as you possibly can. And I actually really quite like that. So let me find it on here. So Arceus Pichu, for whatever reason, hasn't been on the tier list, but this is actually the 13th most played deck overall of the format. And guess what, guys? This is actually a 55% win rate. Again, it's hard to kind of, like, it's hard to imagine because a lot of the archetypes sort of melded together and they branched off from one each other as the meta went on. Again, I was kind of shocked that we didn't have this on the tier list last week because in my mind, it's been around for a little bit longer than that, but really kind of gained popularity over the last few weeks. This to me is like the best Arceus deck, and I actually equate this to be very similar to these sort of Silvally, like Turbo Silvally deck lists, but the thing is that Arceus actually beats Silvally somehow in the head-to-head always in the win rates, which is just weird. Do I think it's better? Like it's crazy to me that like the A+ tier has been reserved for like the best Turbo decks, but you know, the win rates don't lie and the results don't lie. Turbo Arceus, Turbo Silvally, Turbo Flareon, these are decks that are winning and are very successful deck lists. It's just what baby Pokemon have done. And people might not really realize that. And I wonder if it's because maybe these decks aren't super popular or the games just end so quickly. Like you end up conceding before you lose just because the game's over before it began. These deck lists are strong and they're really, really good and they're real contenders. Again, I think that if the meta continued on for another week or 2 weeks, like we would see these really fast-paced, aggressive, like turbo decks is what I call them, you know, really taking over the metagame because they are just that strong. We're going to put Turbo Arceus, Turbo Lightning Arceus right here. I'm actually going to put it, we'll put it here. We'll put it behind the Silvally decks just because it's less proven. Yeah, that's kind of where we're at right now. Baby Pokemon really relevant. Turbo Silvally, Turbo Arceus, Turbo Flareon, all really strong decks that utilize the baby Pokemon. I think the Ho-Oh decks also utilize baby Pokemon. The new or the old, you know, Pikachu EX utilizes the baby Pokemon. Dragonite does as well. Baby Pokemon have been really relevant, and I think that they'll continue to be relevant in the metagame. And this is our final tier list, guys. RIP to all of these decks that have fallen into the not played tier. They are not played for a reason, just because they weren't that good. Shout out to the meme decks in C tier. These are decks that are fun to play. They're really not that good. These are B tier decks. They just, for some reason, are lacking a little bit from being like true meta contenders, but they're really not bad decks, and they can beat really anything above them at any given time. It's just about if you were to play 1,000 games, you know, they're not going to be as successful as the decks above them. A tier is like the bulk of this season, and the main reason why I included the S tier and then the A+ tier, the reason I did that and got rid of the D tier is because like all of these decks in A tier, they're not B tier decks in my mind, right? And the C tier decks aren't D tier, and the B tier isn't C tier. So like that's why we sort of added a tier above A tier and below S tier, is because all of these decks in the A tier, even though they look like they're in the middle of the tier list, are all phenomenally strong decks. And some people are going to disagree with that, but like that's just the reality of it, is that there's so many strong decks in the format. A tier is chock full of a bunch of really good decks. If any of these decks in A tier won this weekend's Ursa Days tournament, I would not be shocked in the slightest, right? And then we have A+ tier. These are the decks that, in my mind, I really do feel like are like truly like powerful decks. They really are kind of differentiating themselves in the metagame. And then S tier, these are just the best decks in the game. You know, we talk about them all the time. So anyway, guys, that's the tier list, the final tier list of A4. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate that. And comment down below what you guys think. This is the final tier list. It was a quick one, hopefully. Shorter than yesterday's Meta Monday, that's for sure. And like I said, we should be getting news on the next mini set in the upcoming days, which is really fun. And we talked about the newly announced Mega Pokemon coming to Pokemon Pocket in yesterday's video. Even though I think those are coming to the game like later on, there's still a bunch of stuff to come before then. So anyway, guys, there you go. Let me know what you guys think. Comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.